In this lecture, we're looking at the formation of Anglicanism and the rise of an entirely different branch of the Protestant movement that would come to shape and dominate the majority of the English-speaking world from the 16th century down until today. And to begin with, we have to make sure we understand what Anglicanism is and what it has come to be. One of the strange things for new students to the study of the Reformation is the extent to which Anglicanism is an enigma. It really doesn't follow any of the same patterns or the same structures, entirely at least, of the kinds of reformations you see in the Lutheran regions in Germany or in the Swiss regions under Calvin and Zwingli and Bullinger and all of these others. It's an enigma. At times, the Anglican Reformation appears to be a top-down imposition of the Protestant movement onto a relatively unwilling populace. There are always people who end up claiming that Anglicanism is a political reformation, that it doesn't really have a great deal of spiritual formation to it, or any sort of substantive Protestant doctrine at its core. Well, I think that myth, that Anglicanism really isn't a Protestant movement, is driven by the fact that it is so different. It is such an enigma. One of the things I like to say is that in order to understand Anglicanism, you have to really change the motif that you're looking at here. We are so used to Luther's somewhat explosive Reformation, or some of the explosive reformations that you see in Switzerland, in France, and in other parts of Europe, where it seems that almost overnight, you go from an overwhelmingly Catholic populace, maybe disgruntled, to suddenly you have a real core of those who are Protestant leading the charge for a Reformed or Reformational church. Well, in the Anglican world, and the development of it in the early years in particular, you have to see it more like a mustard seed, which of course is the parable that Christ tells about the mustard seed, that the kingdom is this smallest seed that grows and grows until it becomes something more substantive and massive than you ever would have thought when you looked at the seed. But it's still a reformation. The reason it can be useful to describe it as a mustard seed, though, is because at one point in the early Anglican movement, the early English Reformation, you can really count on one hand the number of people who are in favor of the Reformation there in their country. The other thing is, and this frankly is underappreciated, so many of the founders and the formers and the shapers of what would become known as Anglicanism end up being martyred or killed for their faith. And that really is something that ought to be appreciated. No one, frankly, in the Lutheran Reformation, and really only Zwingli in the Swiss Reformation, ever really died for their faith in the sense of being slaughtered, being burned at the stake. And so what happens over time is the Anglican movement, the Protestant voice, in England at times does take a more political tone, but this is due in large part to the fact that it had to take a political tone. In England, the will of the king, or later the queen, is ironclad in the shaping of the church. And there really is nothing to compare that to on the continent. Zwingli has to stand before the city council to defend his Reformation and to get it applied there in Zurich. Calvin lived most of his life under the thumb, or at least at friction with the city leaders. But no one had a king like Henry VIII, changing things seemingly with a flick of a wrist. The other factor that we now appreciate more about the English context than we ever really did before is just how inhospitable it was to the Reformation. If you were to plant your feet at the year 1500 and you were to cast about looking for, frankly, the one country that we would believe is the least likely to accept the Reformation, it would be England. A lot of the problems that we have on the continent, things like uneducated clergy or clerical abuse of maybe celibacy or of their power, really doesn't happen in England. You have a really educated clergy. You have a real tight-knit band. If there are problems in the English church, the clergy root it out and get rid of it. And the educational factor is important because a lot of what Luther and Calvin and others are asserting is an alternative understanding of the gospel. It's an intellectual principle, you might say, not entirely, of course, but it's a theological biblical argument that they're making, that the church is wrong and needs to change. And if you have an uneducated clergy, you really don't have the resources to fight it. Well, in England, they did. They had plenty of resources. More importantly, though, the king, the sovereign over England, was really in tight with the papacy. And we'll see this as we go on. from Henry VII to Henry VIII for a number of decades. In fact, for roughly 15 years after Luther's Reformation gets going, there is nothing hospitable to the Lutheran message. Well, the question then is just what happened? How do we go from a devout Roman Catholic country of England to what we now know it to be, which is a real fusion of church and state in a Protestant ethos, in this Anglican ethos? Well, to tell that story, we have to go back into the latter Middle Ages. All of us will be aware of something called the Wars of the Roses. Now, notice the language there. It's wars, it's multiple wars, it's not a single war, and it's the Wars of the Roses. Well, what is this all about? Well, unfortunately, all of this sort of language comes from none other than Shakespeare, who later, during the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, roughly a century or more after the end of the Wars of the Roses, it's Shakespeare who applies to the two houses that were vying for control over England the emblems of the white rose and the red rose. Shakespeare really borrows it from an earlier chronicle, etc. But even in the chronicle, it's not used to the great effect that Shakespeare uses it in his plays. Well, the Wars of the Roses ever since have been known as this, and we do still use the red rose and the white rose as more like an analogy or as an emblem to remember the differences here. No one, though, in the Wars of the Roses would have actually seen themselves full stop as being really identified merely by the color of a rose. Well, what happened was in the Middle Ages, as we get closer to, say, 1500, you have a vying back and forth between two noble houses, the York family, the York dynasty, and the Lancastrian line, or the House of Lancaster. And the way the roses sort of divide up is the York side is considered to be the white rose, and the Lancastrian side is said to be the red rose. Well, for a long period of time, both of these houses really trade off back and forth. Who is going to be king or the sole ruler of England? Back and forth, different dynasties rise up and cast off the other one. Well, both sides actually go back to a single family, the Plantagenet family, and there's all kinds of dynastic squabbles back and forth. We're not going to go into all of that. But it is actually quite dramatic. It's a bit of a soap opera at times. Well, as it happens, the end, really, of the Wars of the Roses happens in 1485, in the Battle of Bosworth Field. And this pits Henry VII as the claimant to the Lancastrian side against Richard III of the Yorkist side. Now, it's important to realize here, Henry VII really had not much of a claim to the throne. His name was Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor traced his lineage back not to a king or a queen, or even to a lesser son from the noble houses, but, if you can believe it, to a queen who, when her husband died, she took on a lover, and she married one of the sort of men of the entourage there in the court, a man by the name of Jasper Tudor. And it's from that line that the Tudor dynasty is descended. Now, make note, this is not a dynastic claim. Dynasties are arranged according to the male line, typically. Very, very rare can you go back and find a female line. But the Lancastrian side had been whipped, and so the next best thing was Henry. Well, for most of us, the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 is something we're not necessarily familiar with, but I can tell you right now, we're all familiar with one of the great slogans that Shakespeare came up with in his play Richard III. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III is said to have been knocked from his horse, and in the play he says, famously, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." And we all know this line, even if we don't know the context. Well, the context is Richard III is essentially being bested on the battlefield. Henry's troops are about to win, and Richard III essentially says, "Have the kingdom, that's fine. I just want to live. Give me a horse and you can have it." But that doesn't happen, and Richard III is slain. And as a result, the Tudor dynasty comes to the throne. Now, we see this even today. If you've ever seen the Tudor Rose, what happens is Henry actually ends up marrying a princess from the Yorkist side, Elizabeth of York. Again, notice the name York. She's from the White Rose side. Well, Henry being a Lancastrian, the intermarrying here is one of the real pivotal moments where the Wars of the Roses cease, because now any lineage, any issue between Henry and Elizabeth is now believed to be bringing both of these sides together. And it's for that reason that whenever you see a Tudor rose, it's a red and a white rose intermixed. Now, what does all this have to do with the English Reformation? Well, put simply, it means that the Tudor dynasty, the very dynasty that will shape all of Anglican history for its first century, has a weak claim to the throne, And if it's going to maintain its claim, having now really, in a manner of speaking, ripped the crown off the sitting king's head and placed it on the head of Henry VII, if it's going to keep its dynasty, it's going to need heirs. And in particular, given the status of lineage and heritage in this day, they're going to need male heirs. That is really the crack in the armor that will eventually become a sort of yawning chasm that allows Protestantism to flood into England. Because when you fast forward, Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, the great king that is beloved and well-known, there's Showtime miniseries about this character, etc., all kinds of movies and Hollywood adaptations of this man. To this day, in fact, Henry VIII is always ranked amongst the top 2 or 3 most beloved kings in English history. Well, Henry VIII is the man who brings Protestantism to England. But notice, it's the dynastic problem in particular that's going to really vex Henry. The story of Henry VIII's involvement with Protestantism is a complex one, and it's not always easy to summarize. But needless to say, from roughly 1509, when he came to the throne, until the late 1520s and on into the 1530s, Henry VIII was a devout Roman Catholic. A lot of this is driven both by personal faith. Henry was very conservative in his theological outlook. But it's also driven by the fact that those who have weak claims to the throne very often will buttress their claim through allegiances to people like the Pope. If the Pope likes Henry, well, he's not going anywhere. No one's going to usurp him and overthrow him. And it's during these early years, in particular, where you see Henry at his most ferocious against Protestantism. Protestant books are banned regularly in England. Henry, to the day he died, hated Luther. In fact, in 1521, Henry VIII himself sat down to write a theological treatise against Luther entitled The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. And the Pope loved the book. He thought it was great. In fact, he loved it so much that he gave a title to Henry, the title of Defender of the Faith. And this is a title that actually is still taken. It's still part of the English monarchy's identity. If you go look at a British pound, you're going to still see things like DF there inscribed, which to this day means Defender of the Faith. Now, of course, today it's Protestant faith, not the Catholic faith, but the origin of that title, the origin of that name, comes from the years when Henry was pretty blistering against Protestantism. These early years are the years of William Tyndale. William Tyndale eventually spends, frankly, the majority of his life in exile down in the Netherlands regions. William Tyndale was a committed Protestant, and he spent the majority of his life translating the Bible into English. Well, it's telling that by the end of his life, Henry actually had William Tyndale killed. He was captured in the Netherlands, churned over to the state, and he was strangled and then eventually burned. So again, in these early years of Henry VIII's reign, from 1509 until roughly the late 1520s, there is no fertile ground for Protestantism. Henry is seeking them out, and if he finds them, they are burned or executed, or at the very least exiled. Now, this raises one minor point that's worth noting now. Typically, the story of the English Reformation tells the story of this widespread sort of quasi-Protestant movement called Lollardy. And the Lollards get their name and their origin from John Wycliffe, the medieval Oxford professor who led something of a Reformation there, and who championed, amongst other things, the vernacular scriptures, the scriptures in English. Well, the old story is that there was this widespread native Protestantism, you might say, that syncs up a bit with Protestantism, and it's already this fertile ground. What we now know, though, is that the presence of Lollards was pretty piecemeal and pretty weak. There were Lollards around, but by and large, they were pretty reclusive. They didn't always come out. And it was certainly not widespread enough to bolster or propel England or Henry VIII or anyone into the Reformation. No, in fact, in England, under Henry, for the first, say, opening decade to 15 years of his reign, there is no Protestantism that's going to land on his soil if he has anything to say about it. Now, one last piece, one of the more famous stories, again, is of the University of Cambridge and something called the White Horse Inn. Now, the White Horse Inn was a tavern there in the city. By the way, if you go there today, there is something that calls itself the White Horse Inn. That is not the original. The original is actually gone, though there is a plaque that still sort of decorates this alleyway between two colleges that tells you where the White Horse Inn used to be. Well, the White Horse Inn is, again, this sort of apocryphal story, this legendary story of a lot of people in university reading Protestant works and really being inspired by it. But like the Lollards, frankly, often too much is made of this. We move from a picture of a ragtag group of people to some sort of movement that sparks there in Cambridge. But the fact of the matter is, the White Horse Inn was really nothing more than a glorified book club. And even though we can admit fully that the people there involved in the English Reformation, those who were reading Luther's works, were committed Protestants, but they are very, very few in number. There's just simply not enough numbers there to sustain anything like a serious movement towards Protestantism, particularly not with Henry VIII on the throne. So what happened? Well, the issue happened that Henry was having no male heirs. The same year he was crowned, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine was a very, very well-to-do princess. She was one of the younger princesses from the Spanish house of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs, by the way, who sent Columbus sailing over the ocean blue in 1492. Well, Catherine of Aragon was a princess that had come up to England not to marry Henry, but to marry Henry's older brother Arthur. This was an intermarrying of the two houses, and this was a very, very important move for England to marry into this powerful Catholic dynasty from Spain. The problem, though, is Arthur had died young, only several years into his marriage. Well, no, it is not normal in this day and age for someone to marry their dead brother's wife, to marry their sister-in-law. This was against canon law, and most believed, at some level at least, that it was against biblical law. Well, kings get preferential treatment, and this is what happened. When Henry married Catherine of Aragon, there was a papal dispensation given that suspended the rules in this case and allowed Henry to marry Catherine. Now, a lot of this is dynastic squabbles, making sure that the very important princess who has landed on English soil is not simply shipped back, ending the partnership between these houses. But it's also good for Henry. Henry does seem to have really loved Catherine, and they were married in 1509, and both coronated roughly about the exact same time. What happens, though, is from 1509 to 1525, which is the last recorded case that we know of the two sharing a marriage bed. During those years, there were a number of miscarriages. In fact, a pretty staggeringly high number. Trying to diagnose this medically from afar, with 500 years between us and them, is a bit difficult. But it does seem to be that there was, frankly, something biologically at fault here. Whether it was something to do with Catherine or with Henry, it's hard to say. But the miscarriages kept coming. They did have one child, though, the Princess Mary, who will become Mary Tudor, who we'll see in a later lecture. But there were no male heirs. And so at some point around 1525, or as late as 1527, Henry begins to have what we today call his scruple of conscience. And a lot of people say in this somewhat cynical twisting of scripture by Henry. But he does seem to believe that the Bible had somehow cursed him. Reading through the Deuteronomic and Levitical laws, Henry found a real important verse that said, quote, "You shall not marry your dead brother's wife." And it says, "If you do, you shall have no children. You'll be cursed." Henry seems to believe, and he really moves this way pretty quickly, that what had happened with the papal dispensation to allow him to marry Catherine should not have happened. Now, this is not, by and large, terribly controversial. No one would believe, for example, that if it was biblical law, that the Pope could suspend that law. The question here is this rule, the barring of marrying your dead brother's wife, is this biblical law or is this canon law? If it's canon law, well, the Pope can suspend it. If it's biblical law, he cannot. Well, what happens with Henry is he moves from believing that the Pope had the right to suspend this rule to ever increasingly he comes to the conclusion that the Pope should not have done this. And so the scruple of conscience is that he believes he is sinning by being married to Catherine of Aragon. And there are all kinds of complexities here. But around 1527, Henry does eventually come in contact with, and he begins a love affair, not sexual at first, but he begins a love affair with Anne Boleyn. He falls in love with her, frankly. Now, he initially seeks out that they become sort of a mistress relationship, that she simply be there for him physically, let's say. But she holds back. She says no, she will only marry him. And that really becomes the sort of gasoline on the fire for Henry to really press for the Pope to absolve the marriage between he and Catherine. And so that's what he does. In 1529, there was a famous trial, the trial at Blackfriars. And what's going on here is the Pope is willing to hear Henry's case. In this case, Henry is, you might say, putting himself on trial. So even though Henry wants this, what's going on is the Pope is, you might say, sitting in judgment, sitting in trial with Henry as the defendant as to whether or not he is breaking God's law by being married to Catherine. Now, the trial of Blackfriars is high drama, all kinds of ins and outs. At one point, Catherine drops one of these kind of Hollywood bombs in the courtroom by declaring suddenly that she and Arthur had not had sex, that he had been unable during their marriage, which of course would mean the law is not in effect at all, that she was a virgin when she married Henry. The other complexity is Catherine, being from a very important house, she was the aunt to the sitting Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The same Charles V, by the way, who put Luther on trial. That Charles V is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Well, it's that political piece that is the most pivotal here, because when the Pope sends a cardinal up to convene this trial and to hear it, he whispers into his ear, "Don't you dare make a decision one way or the other." The Pope really is in an awkward spot here. He neither wants to ruin or frustrate Charles, the most powerful man in Europe, but he also wants to keep a good relationship with England. Well, in the end, the cardinal sues and finds a way out by declaring, by the end of the trial, that they were going to go into recess for the hot summer months. And this is an old tradition. You would break for the summer and you would come back in the fall. Well, the cardinal scoots and he flees back to Rome, never to return to England. As a result, Henry is mortified and embarrassed. This is a public show trial, and he has now been, he feels, betrayed by the Pope. From this point on, from the trial of Blackfriars on, Henry increasingly is ready to just simply do away with the Pope. In 1531, for example, he issues from Parliament a claim of praemunire against the clergy. Now, the statute of praemunire is an important one in the Middle Ages. It's actually an anti-treason law. This law was put into place that basically said citizens cannot appeal to a monarch or to a ruler outside of England for either guidance or direction, that's treasonous. If you're under the kingship of England, that is your sovereign. You do not ask, say, the King of Scotland or France what they think you ought to be doing. Well, notice, here in 1531, the statute of praemunire is leveraged against the clergy. Why? Well, they are appealing to an outside ruler, this Pope guy down there in Rome. They are treasonous. They should be appealing only to their king. In this, you'll see, in fact, a kernel of where Henry VIII is going. He is essentially going to remove the Pope. Now, as we'll see, Henry doesn't want to get rid of traditional Catholicism, but he wants to get rid of the Pope. And so that's what he is beginning to do. And this all comes to a head in 1534 with the very, very important Act of Royal Supremacy. In the Act of Royal Supremacy, which to a greater or lesser extent is, you might say, still in effect today, with obvious exceptions and changes to that rule over the years, the Act of Supremacy declares that the king, the monarch, is the head of the church there in England. To this day, again, just to show that this is relatively still in effect, the Queen of England, Elizabeth II, is said to be the governor of the English church, not of the Catholic Church or other denominations, but over the Anglican Church. Well, this begins here with Henry. Now, it's often sometimes said that Anglicanism is Catholicism without the Pope. That is a wildly anachronistic and false view of the history of Anglicanism. But if there's anybody who you might say actually is Catholic without the Pope, it's Henry. He wants the seven sacraments, he wants traditional religion, he wants at least the majority of the cultic and the ritual practices to remain, but he has now tossed the Pope out, here in 1534. Now, the problem with this, of course, is so much of the Catholic heritage and practice and belief is grounded on the Pope as the vicar of Christ and on his authority. One of the great jokes, actually, of Henry is that he is like a man who threw someone off the top of a steeple and ordered them to stop halfway down. Throw the Pope out of England, and so much of the Protestant message suddenly does begin to creep in. And it's actually very telling. Throughout a great number of the years of the 1530s, in fact, Protestants begin to insinuate themselves and come closer and closer and closer to Henry, and he begins to give them power and influence and authority on shaping not just the state, but also the church. In fact, it's during this moment, during these 1530s, when Thomas Cranmer, in many ways one of the main founders of the Anglican ethos through the Book of Common Prayer, which we'll look at later, comes to have a say or a voice in Henry's ear. Well, if that's Henry, if that's how the Anglican Reformation gets going, what are we to make of this? Well, a couple of things. You have to realize that while it is true that Henry started the Anglican Church over marriage and sex and babies, it would be wrong to believe that Anglicanism itself is founded on these reasons. Rather, you might say that Henry changed his mind about the authority of the Pope because of those issues for him personally. Rightly or wrongly, whether we think Henry is a saint or a sinner during this process, that itself is more the proxy war that starts Anglicanism. It's the scruple of conscience, in other words, that leads Henry to kick the Pope out. And it's that move, the disentangling of the monarchy from the papacy, that is the entree, that is the entry point for Protestantism to come to England. Now, it will take some time, but it is at this point that you begin to see a noticeable uptick in the amount of influence and the amount of sway that Protestantism begins to have in England. And you carry that forward for a century, and eventually you have jolly old Protestant England. Well, the first major lurch forward, because Henry, again, he kept pumping the brakes. He kept trying to stop too much Protestantism from coming into his land. Again, he hated Luther till the day that he died. But yet he had Cranmer as his right-hand man, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, who loved Luther and actually approved of his gospel. Cranmer was Protestant. Very, very complex. Well, the real lurch forward, you might say, came with the death of Henry and the rise of his son, Edward VI, to the throne. The strange thing about Henry is he did eventually have a son with his third wife. Edward was born, and because he was a male heir, he gets bumped to the front of the line, and so he is being groomed all throughout his life to be the immediate successor to Henry. Well, Edward was, believe it or not, raised and trained by Protestant tutors. Henry, and people are really sort of scratch their head about this. They're not quite sure what to make of it, but Henry does seem to kind of either take his eye off the ball, or he simply just kind of leaves it up to other people to determine who the best tutors will be for Edward. Well, given the influence and the sway of Protestants there in Henry's court, by no means the only figures there, but certainly a dominating voice, well, they eventually picked Protestant tutors. And so in a strange twist, Edward was raised, spending the majority of his life, in terms of at least his education, studying the scriptures, learning Protestant theology, and frankly becoming entirely ingratiated and ingrained with the Protestant faith. And so in 1547, when Henry died, there was a bit of a coup. There was a privy council, a sort of board of rulers that was set to rule for Edward until he reached the age of 18, which would be the year of his majority. Edward at this point is a boy king. He's only the age 9. But the privy council, the people ruling for Edward, were entirely, again, because of some intrigue there in the court, made up of evangelical Protestants. So again, almost overnight, you go from Henry VIII, who was pumping the brakes, to this boy king, Edward, who is being raised as a Protestant, and to the day that he died, there were all kinds of indications that he was a zealously committed Protestant. But not only that, you have a board governing on behalf of Edward, who are all Protestant. Well, it's the reign of Edward that you have this great lurch forward. All the Catholic monasteries and votaries and cultic shrines, etc., are suppressed and destroyed. Not only that, but despite the fact that the populace was still overwhelmingly Catholic, Cranmer, through the board, issued not one, but 2 books of common prayer, one in 1549 and one in 1552. Now, these books of common prayer are sometimes misread, and the misreading of them goes back, I think, to the misreading of what the context is. If you believe that England is overwhelmingly Protestant or Lollard, well, then Cranmer's prayer books seem, on at least one surface level, to be pretty conservative. They seem to be relatively Catholic or Catholicizing. They're kind of a mixture of Catholic and Protestant liturgies. Not fully, by any means. There's still only 2 sacraments, and the Lord's Supper is described as spiritual eating, not physical eating. It's hardly Catholic. But it's also not Swiss or German in the sort of overhaul of the liturgy and doctrine of the church. Well, if you flip that around and you realize that with the coup, with the takeover of the Privy Council under Edward and with Edward himself coming to the throne, and with the fact that Henry, not that long before, had sort of lurched England into this quasi-Protestant camp, what you ought to realize is that the populace is overwhelmingly Catholic. They don't want a Reformation still. And so when you actually look at the 1549 prayer book, the first one, it is piecemeal because what you see Cranmer doing here is slowly spoon-feeding the Word of God and the preaching and the liturgy of the church into a world, into a context that is overwhelmingly Catholic. Not only that, but there were count them, two massive riots in 1549 when the first one was issued by the Catholic populace. They knew what this was. They knew this was Protestant, and they knew that it was moving away from the traditional forms of worship that they had known. So the context really describes why the 1549 prayer book was somewhat halting, somewhat piecemeal. It also explains why just 3 years later, in 1552, Cranmer issued a second edition, this one overwhelmingly Protestant. He is taking one more baby step forward towards the Protestant faith. Well, the crisis at this point for Anglicanism, the problem, is that you have a populace, a laity, that has not fully embraced or become normatized to a Protestant ethos. You have a more top-down Reformation. Now, it's a myth to say that England is top-down and everything else is grassroots. Again, go to Zwingli's Reformation in Zurich. It's as top-down as you get. The city council just declares that they're going to be Protestant. And you see this in other cities throughout Europe as well. People just forget this fact when they look at England. But it is still a relatively top-down Reformation. It's still king-led, you might say, or government-led. But in a world before the separation of church and state, that's not all that verboten. The problem, though, is that Edward dies in 1553, just a year after the second prayer book was issued. In many ways, the death of Edward meant the death of a more, you might say, Calvinistic or Reformed or really kind of heady, robust Protestantism ever coming to England. The seed had only been but barely planted there in England. And, more importantly, with the death of Edward, there rose to the throne Mary Tudor. Mary, the daughter of Catherine, who, like her mother before her, was devoutly Catholic. And we'll look at the transition from Mary to Elizabeth in a later lecture, but you need to see this now. From Henry to Edward, you have a lurch from sort of half-Protestant, kind of kick the Pope out, but try to keep it much the same, to this fully Protestant faith there under Edward, to now, in 1553, back to the Catholic fold. And 5 years after that, back to the Protestant fold. This back and forth really becomes the context and the, you might say, the rationale for what will eventually become the Anglican ethos, at least culturally. That is to say, the scar tissue that builds up from the ripping back and forth, leads to a lack of formation within Anglicanism of some of the more robust scholastic or confessional identifications that you see in Calvinism or in Lutheranism. In fact, Anglicanism will wait for a couple of generations before it really begins to ingrain and to deepen what it means to be Anglican.